Hi everyone, I'm Naila Huda and you're watching Link at Astro AWANI. Now, before we begin, I'd like for us to take a look at some housekeeping rules.
Welcome to Astro AWANI Link's brand new webinar platform designed to enhance your experience. A couple of hygiene points. We recommend that you shut down other video and audio tabs to clear up your bandwidth for a better experience. Should you experience any technical difficulties such as lag or interruptions, please click on the red reconnect button. If there is a major glitch that is experienced by a majority of the people in the room, we may reset the entire system. Just sit back and relax. You will be taken to a new room automatically. If you have a question you would like to ask the speakers, kindly mark your remark as a question. And finally, we would appreciate it if you could tell us what you think of your webinar experience. Do give us a 5-star rating if you like the session and write to us via the contact us form on our website.
All right, hi again, everyone. I'm Naila Huda from Astro AWANI. Thanks so much for joining me and all the speakers today. We've got a very interesting topic, so let's just jump right into it. For decades, working permanent full-time or part-time jobs has been the norm, working for a set number of hours in a week and performing the same set of tasks from day to day. But these days, we see the gig economy playing a much bigger role in shaping the future of the workforce and shaking up the traditional 9 to 5 working world. And fun fact, the term gig actually goes back as far as a century ago when jazz musicians coined the term to mean a one-off show. But now, the gig economy comprises millions of people in a variety of jobs, from Grab drivers to freelance artists. And participation in the gig economy has grown exponentially, especially since the onset of the pandemic, due in part to the increased reliance on gig workers to home deliver necessities whilst most of us were locked up at home. What's most appealing about the gig economy is the flexibility and the low barrier of entry it offers to workers. But to what degree of flexibility do gig workers actually have? It's still up for debate when roles sometimes aren't as flexible as they seem, and as workers are incentivized to work according to when companies need them or maybe during specific hours with high demand. What's also up for debate is the push and pull factor. To what extent is the gig economy appealing to workers, and how much actually is their participation out of necessity? As the gig workforce grows to play a more vital role in the global economy, this begs a few questions. How much do we actually understand about the ecosystem? How do we ensure gig workers are entitled to basic rights and protection while also providing a conducive environment for gig companies to flourish? Business growth and the empowerment of workers are not mutually exclusive. So today, we will unpack the challenges faced by workers, what companies in the gig economy can do with the government to protect them, and how can we define these rights within realistic policy expectations. So just to give you a rundown of our discussion today, I'd like for us to first define what the gig economy and gig workers actually mean. Moving on then to the challenges. Lastly, what would be the best next step forward for the gig economy in Malaysia? So to provide perspectives from the business and industry relations side, we have Sean Goh, Managing Director of Grab Malaysia, as well as Lina Tan, Managing Director of Red Communications. So a little background, in his role in Malaysia, Sean oversaw business growth, city expansions, customer experience, media, and public affairs across multiple business units at Grab. Lina, on the other hand, founded Red Communications in 1999, and since then, she has worked in production houses in Malaysia and Singapore, producing a variety of programs, one of which includes my personal favorite, Tiga R. To provide policy perspectives, we have with us Dato Emeritus Professor Dr. Norma Mansoor, Director of Social Wellbeing Research Center, and Nelita Omar, Research Director of Centris Think Tank, the Center. Professor Norma's main research interests include topics relating to social protection, aging, public policy, development, and governance. She has published 8 books and many more academic journal articles, book chapters, and has spoken in more than 80 conferences and events. Melita has a background in development studies. She was appointed as the Special Officer to the Prime Minister of Malaysia in 2003, and prior to that, she was a consultant with Boston Consulting Group. So thank you so much to our panelists. This panel discussion will begin with 30 minutes of questions and answers with our panelists, and after that, we will be taking questions from the audience before ending at 3 p.m. So without further ado, let's introduce all our panelists. If you can all switch on your cameras and microphones and just say a little hello to our audience.
Hello.
Do we have everyone on already?
Hello.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. Do we have everyone on? So we have Sean, we have Nell, Prof. Norma. Is Lina in the house? We could have Lina to say a little hello to our audience. That might take a little while, but as we wait for that, maybe we can begin our discussion. I'd like to start with Professor Norma. Thank you so much for joining us. How do we first define the gig economy and gig workers? What are its current definition in our context?
Thank you, Naila, and good afternoon, everyone. As you mentioned, gig is a project, is temporary, is as opposed to full-time employment. And I think it's also a generational thing, because my generation would go or would appreciate full-time employment where job security is the main objective. With the gig economy or gig workers, they appreciate flexible hours, non-tying, non-contract type of work. So it is about the relationship between the worker and the economic unit, i.e. the employer or whoever that you are doing the work with. So this is something that is not new. In 2018, the ILO did a work, an extensive research to understand and to see whether this is in line with the definition of decent work. Because in 2015, the Convention 204 talked about decent work. And it was then essentially to address women who normally work long hours. They are not paid. So there is no contract about what is her rights, what will be the benefits. Yeah. So with gig workers, for some, they experience a similar type of working arrangement. So, but you were talking about the push and pull factors. The push factors will be attracting, or rather for someone to be going into doing part-time work, for some of them, it's not necessarily by choice. It is something that they, especially with the crisis, or it came to light, especially in the world, was when the global global crisis, in 2007, 2009, where employment in the US was unemployment was very high, and most people lost their jobs, and they will have to turn to some kind of contract work and with less working benefits. Yeah, so one has to differentiate between when one is doing by choice, or is it one doesn't have a choice. Yeah, it's not something that you can choose to do. And also, it depends on, there are different kinds of gig workers. Yeah, some are earning or doing very well, and some are not necessarily earning well. So you can talk about informal sector as well. Yeah, so gig are usually, even if they are in the formal sector, their type of work is an informal type of arrangement. Whereas people who are in the informal sector, they are self-employed and all that, and it can range from being very lowly paid and highly skilled as well. Yeah. So I'll pass it back to you, Naila.
Thank you so much, Prof. I like that little bit of history in the origin of the gig economy, especially with an emphasis on female participation in the workforce and in the informal economy. I thought that was very interesting. I did not know that myself. Nell, why do we see challenges in defining these terms? Why does it encompass so many roles, and what challenges does that pose then in a policy context? And why is it important to have a definite understanding of what these terms mean?
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Naila. I think there's been an issue because of the way that it has been used in recent times. In policy documents, in reports, and even in the media, it's come to mean a lot of very different things. So, for instance, I've been asked whether farmers and financial planners are gig workers, for example. If we go back to the definition that Prof has offered just now, the completion of one-off tasks, non-stipulation of fixed employment hours, low barriers to entry, those are all good markers of what is a gig work or what is in the gig economy, right? The fact that it can be mediated also by technology, so like gig platforms, online service marketplaces, is also an important factor. To your question about why it's important to define these terms, right? It's important for two reasons. So for me, one of these terms, the term gig economy, it includes a class of informal work that is a little bit different from older conceptions of informal work, right? So we used to talk about solopreneurs, right, on one hand, then also like on temporary workers on the other end that receives, some kind of monthly wage, even though there's no employment contract. So there is a class of work within gig work that is slightly different from these two extreme ends. To defining these terms correctly and being clear about the boundaries of the term is important because it's important to figure out what their employment status is, which I would argue is not adequately covered by the classifications that we have today. And this is important not just for naming per se, right? Employment status has a lot of impact on issues like workers' rights, social protection coverage, who ensures that they are covered, the split of responsibility between state and the quote-unquote employer, and so on and so forth. There are many others. So yeah, these are basically the reasons why we need to get the term correct.
Thank you so much, Nell. And I think we'll dive deeper into what in actuality these policies can look like once we have a better understanding of what the definitions can mean. Sean, speaking about these definitions, I think for me as well as a lot of other people, companies like Grab have reshaped what most of us think of when we hear the word gig economy. The movers and shakers of the industry, such as Grab, can have a huge impact on what the entire ecosystem can look like. So what are some initiatives that Grab has in place for your gig workers?
Yeah, I can talk about this for a long time, but I don't want this to become a sort of like corporate session. But there's lots of programs that we put in place, and I think it's still not enough. We're still working on new ones. But if I had to choose maybe two major ones that I think really matter, the first one is just general benefits. So in the gig system, I think there's a misconception that there's a lack of benefits because you don't have an employer who's willing to pay for these benefits. Actually, what we're seeing is that benefits can be even better than in a traditional employment model, because as a digital platform, we actually have more volume and power to sort of bring these benefits on board. So, for example, for Grab, we have fuel discounts, we've got maintenance discounts, cheaper insurance and financial services, just giving access to financial products. We've extended these products to the family as well, and then of course deals on F&B and consumer. I think you'll find that most traditional employers would typically not bring so many benefits on board. So that's one. The second one I think is sort of maybe even more important, which is the concept of protection. Sometimes people talk about the gig economy not having a safety net, which I'll talk more about later. But for me, one defining factor about the digital gig economy is that it is a safety net for the society in the sense that anyone who just runs out of a job or are in between jobs can just switch on this income in as little as 9 days in Grab, for example. Since the MCO started last year, we've seen more than 50,000 signups, for example. So that's 50,000 less unemployment. So that is the safety net. But the question is this safety net strong enough? Can we strengthen it, right? So on the topic of protection, one typical conversation is around future retirement savings and social protection. So we do work with EPF and SOCSO, for example, to incentivize contributions. We have a group policy for personal accidents. We don't make this very public, but basically every job on Grab is covered. And then we've got sort of safety. Safety I can talk about for another hour, but basically technology is, I think, one of the biggest catalysts for safety. I'll just give one quick example. Every single delivery or ride on Grab is tracked in terms of telematics data. We know how fast people are going, how hard they're braking. And that data can be used to sort of continuously inform decisions on who needs to be, for example, retrained on road safety rules. So that's just one quick example.
Okay, thanks, Sean. That raises a lot of questions for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people. I thought one particular thing that was interesting was how you saw, gig platforms as becoming a safety net, and how benefits can be better in the traditional model of the workforce. So a lot of interesting things to pick out from there. But I do want to move on to Lina, who maybe can provide a different perspective or perhaps the same thing. Lina, I think before the advent of e-hailing companies, gig workers, at least for myself, were more often associated with the arts industry, such as Red Communications. So what have been some initiatives at your production house, and particularly since you've been in the industry for much longer, how do you see these initiatives have evolved throughout time?
Okay, well, yes, we've been in the industry for more than 20 over years, and the industry, the arts industry, particularly the film and television commercial industry, we rely a lot on freelancers. In those days, the word gig doesn't even exist, so we use the word freelancers, which technically means that people who are not employed. And so what we do is then we hire. We have a whole range of different freelancers, ranging from actors to, of course, your cameraman, your camera crew, your gaffer, your lighting grip, your art department, your wardrobe, your makeup artist. Everyone is hired on a project basis with contracts based on the project. So if you have a movie set, like when we do a movie, we hire about close to 100 to 150 people to 200 people, depending. If we have a scene with 50 extras, there you go, we need 50 extras. So in essence, this is the practice and this is the normal in the industry from then till now. And in terms of changes, I guess with the advent of digital, it's much easier, of course, to find people. You have very small productions like digital productions saying, I need some extras, an actor who wants to act in it. I need a parent young woman who looks like, who's a Chinese, blah, 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 blah. And then they put it up on, say, some of the sites like Nation Facebook, Freelance Facebook, or they put it up on casting sites. We put it up on social media. And we get lots of calls. So it's much easier to find talent nowadays. It's not so easy to find the more skilled workers. Like, you need to know where to go to find a good art director, a good makeup artist, specialized makeup artist. There are probably less than 10. You can count on your fingers. It's not the kind of industry where, unfortunately, the entry level. While the entry level can be low at the production side, everybody can be a PA because, you're required to make coffee, pick up rubbish. No, I'm just joking. But it's true. That's mostly the entry level. But generally, if you want to be specialized, like if you want to be a gaffer, you want to be a grip, you want to be a art director, you want to be a director, now there's courses to do that. But for the rest of the people, you really start at the lowest entry level point. Literally, you make the coffee, carry the bags, sweep the floors, unfortunately, but yes.
Okay, thanks, Lina. I think that gives us a much wider view of what gig workers can actually mean, as opposed to Grab drivers that we're so often used to, but it actually goes much further than that and much wider than that. And Nell, I want to speak just directly about the challenges, or more specifically, what kind of challenges do gig workers actually face in terms of, in the policy context?
I think in the policy context, because we have a classification that is pretty much a dichotomy between employee and independent contractor, right? There are certain things that will fall through the cracks. So for instance, we have a model where we relied very much on employers traditionally to, for instance, enroll people into social protection schemes, right? Just taking one small example. When we move to different types of employment relationships where it's not a typical employer-employee relationship, then whose responsibility is it? So the debate goes that as a contractor, it should be your responsibility, right? But you will get into a situation where there will be under-enrollment in social protection, right? And so I'm not saying that this is necessarily a job for the quote unquote employer or the gig platform or the online marketplace, right? It is a discussion, it is a policy debate that needs to happen to answer the question of whose responsibility is it to ensure that there is enough social protection coverage, there is enough basic income, because as mentioned by Lina, touched upon by Prof as well, and yeah, to some extent Sean, there are different brackets of take-home pay depending on the value, right, of the task or the service that you have performed. So different groups of these workers are going to have very different needs. And so that, again, we come to the problem of classification and figuring out, okay, how do we solve challenges around social protection coverage, around enough basic income, and so on and so forth.
Okay, I'd like to move on to Professor Norma. We recently saw a landmark decision in the UK to classify Uber drivers as workers. I think we do need to touch on that a little bit. It's an interesting example. What do you think can be done in Malaysia to protect our gig workers? Should it be done within existing policy structures, or do we need to re-examine our labor policy in its entirety, and going back to the trouble of defining and classifying these workers, should we then be more specific in defining them according to their industries or their pay brackets, or how do you think is the best way to move forward?
I think it depends on what is the policy goal here. Yeah, what is it that we are trying to achieve? Are we because I think we have to look at the gig economy not just on the gig economy, but the economy as a whole. Yeah. If we are talking about moving towards becoming a high income economy, yeah, then the issue of knowledge base, knowledge gap, yeah, knowledge gaps, productivity gaps, financial gaps in the gig economy or the self-employed. There are issues there because they form a big percentage of our population. In most countries, it's about 30 to 40%. And in some developing countries, it's more than that. Yeah. So you're talking about underemployment, time-related underemployment. Yeah. That some of them work less hours. I mean, we are talking about how many hours do we work per week nowadays? Is it 30-hour week? So for some gig workers, it's less than that. Yeah. So there are several issues there that we have to look into, and making it. I'm not altogether for formalizing gig workers because there are a lot of issues there. But at least we have to look into the social protection aspect of it. Yeah. On one, yeah. So there are a couple of things here. One is the social protection aspect, and the other aspect, as I mentioned earlier, if you are moving, you want the economy or you want the gig workers and every Malaysian to contribute to the productivity of the nation, then we also have to look at the gaps that I was talking about. Yeah, the productivity gap, the knowledge due to the knowledge gap, and also the financial gap. So, but we have to be careful when you try to formalize an informal or self-employed type of work, which is the gig economy is, that we do not want to run into the difficulty or the challenge of making it difficult, costly, and punishing. I like what Sean pointed out, because we did this work at the faculty with one of my colleagues about how in Malaysia, the informal sector or the informality provided a safety net for the 1997 crisis, because people who were laid off started to open garage, hawkers, everywhere. They start to spring up everywhere, and that became the safety net for Malaysians. Yeah, so you do not want to make it very difficult for people to start to earn a living. But on the other hand, we are also concerned about the two things that I mentioned. Yeah, the social protection, which Nell has elaborated, and also the gaps that that should be addressed. But as we proceed with our discussions, I think we're going to talk about some of the initiatives that Malaysia is coming up with, and some of us are proposing to the government, that how do we address these two big problems or challenges that we're dealing with the gig economy. Yeah, thank you.
Naila, if I can interject a little bit.
Yes, I do actually want to prompt the next question to you. I think you might have some interesting views on that. Do go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just wanting to say that I concur with Prof in a lot of ways, but I think I come from a slightly different point of view, perhaps. So some of the work that we did actually does point to the fact that people do appreciate having something that is very flexible and have very low barriers to entry, because it does smooth out the rough edges, right? Especially in the last year that we have, with people getting furloughed, with people getting even retrenched, right? It provides a huge source of comfort to be able to go somewhere and be able to earn supplementary income, right? So I think, yes, I agree definitely that you shouldn't make it harder, right? So, but maybe where we're stuck currently in the current conversation is that there is this question about wanting to formalize or not formalize. For me, I don't know whether that is the framework that we should be looking at. Maybe we should be asking a different question, right? What is how should we classify this if we had a clean slate, for instance, right? So I would strongly propose looking at the power relationship, like governing the job. And by that, I mean, like, what is the degree of control that the worker faces over key aspects of the job, right? Or the degree of freedom that the worker has. So for instance, like even taking like the film industry, right? Some workers have a lot of freedom over certain key aspects of the jobs, and like certain, like for instance, production crew that has to be there all day, they don't have a lot of freedom over the aspects of their job. Same thing with food delivery riders, right? So theoretically, a rider that advertises on social media or some kind of online marketplace, right, and has like access to the market, to the end customer, that rider has a very high degree of control and freedom over their own work. But a rider that gets a job via a gig platform, they have certain aspects of their job kind of control, right, and certain rules to abide by. So this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Imposing control or standards and giving up some kind of job freedom is not, I mean, the worker may get more jobs and more income that way, right? Depending on the market structure. But I guess what I'm getting at is, the relevant question is, what are fair terms for this type of power relationship and working arrangement? And that is the kind of policy discussion that we should be having today.
Yeah, I do agree. I think we should not just constrain ourselves to just looking at the question, yes, formalized or not formalized. I think there's a lot of nuances here to take into account, especially from a worker's perspective, right?
Yeah.
How much power and control should one actually have, and how much of it then actually boils down to the nature of their own job. Can one worker actually have that much control and freedom when that is just really the nature of their job? Should the government step in and enforce certain controls around that? I do want to hear from Sean. How does Grab see this balance in formalizing, but at the same time making sure there's enough room for the company to grow? Do you see this as sort of trying to achieve an equilibrium, or how do you frame this?
Yeah, a few things I wanted to say. Actually, I agree with most of the points. The first one was on barriers. So I think we're all sort of aligned on sort of this concept of making sure that the flexible income opportunities remain accessible. To give you a sense of barriers, when the e-hailing regulations were rolled out in 2019, we immediately saw 30% of our gig economy participants drop out. Like, that's just the immediate fallout. Imagine all the other people who were deterred from accessing this supplementary income afterwards. So I think no matter what we do with policy and regulations, we need to be very careful not to impose new barriers. That's number one. And then number two, this concept of formal and informal. I don't actually see the gig economy as informal. In fact, it's kind of as formal as it gets. Like, all jobs are recorded. The earnings breakdown is all clear and transparent. Quality ratings, training is done. Feedback is all transparent and shared back. Safety data. So it's actually very formal. I think maybe the real question, as Nell pointed out, actually is, how do we make sure that they receive not just a safety net that they can turn on when things get tough or when they're underemployed? How do we make sure they have the best safety net? And this is the question on social protection. We all know that most people, including Malaysians, are not incentivized to save for their future selves. Let future me worry about this. And that's why we have got social sort of programs that force people to put money in. I'll give you this contrast, right? So, recently iSinar sort of got mobilized, money came out, 3 million something Malaysians. That's 1 in 5 Malaysians in the labor force got some form of payout up to 10,000 ringgit. Immediately, we saw more than 10% of our drivers just disappear. If you're trying to order food today or in the past week and you're finding it hard to get a driver, this is why. I'm so sorry. And that actually prompts a question, right? If the moment I get to draw down from my future self, I'm going to stop working, that's a real problem. And the only way to solve this is two things. Number one, make sure that people continue to earn income so that they don't have to draw down on their future savings. And number two, once they're comfortable and they can earn enough, can we either incentivize or mandate some sort of contribution to their future savings? I think that's the crux of the question here.
All right, thanks, Sean. Lena, I feel like when we touched on the issue of freedom and control that a gig worker has, I think this can probably translate to a much deeper meaning for those in the arts industry. Having creative control and freedom over your work, I believe, is something very important to all workers, but particularly more so for those in the arts industry. How do you see this discussion, this narrative of formalizing and not formalizing? What do you see is perhaps the most specific needs of the workers in your company and the arts industry as a whole?
Yeah, so I was kind of thinking what Nell said. And okay, so I also wear two hats. I'm also sitting on the board of FINAS at the moment. And we have had these discussions a lot of times. So again, as an employer, you are looking for obviously the best people in the industry to hire, right? And where do you go? You go to your regulars. Now, when we talk to the people, the makeup artists, the workers, the gaffers, the director of photography, where do they go to have protection? Do they have a union? Because they all operate as individuals, right? Now, there are organizations, one namely called Profima, which is an organization that actually, unfortunately, there was a huge umbrella. And a couple of years, in order for producers like me to get a license to produce a film, I have to get a license from FINAS. And in order for me to get the license from FINAS, I have to hire from these people who are all registered under associations, whether it's Profima for all the gaffer, the crew, the production managers, or some Seniman for all the actors, or from Karyawan, or even FDAM, Directors Association, Film Directors Association. So now the issue is that, like a lot of the people who are in the industry, the entry level, you graduate, you have to join these associations. And the biggest gripe from the people on the ground is that, okay, here I am having to spend another, 200 ringgit or another 40 ringgit just to join an association that does not give me anything. No protection, nothing. They don't. I mean, they have a once a year AGM, but they do nothing for me. And as an employer, when these people join this association, as employer, I get nothing from them either. Like they don't guarantee me if that person is an FDM member or Seniman member, they're any better than the person who's not. They're just meaningless associations that don't do anything for either side of the party. Now, this is where the discussion is for our side. How do we then protect both sides of the parties? The people working in the industry as well as the employers. How do we protect also the entry level? How do we know if a person can say, hey, I'm a credible art director. I've done all these projects. That's the only way we go by profiles. We say, okay, great, you've done this movie, you've done that movie, okay. And because the industry is so small, chances are we'll probably just give a call to like, hey, fellow producers. Again, then the issue of producers, which is the people who hire these fellas. You know, we give contracts out, but when it comes to our crew, which is the gaffer, the crew, they're like, we have about 30 old people. There's no way we're going to give a contract to everybody for, say, 1 day shoot, right? We'll just say, okay, finish the 1 day shoot, here you go, you pay. It's like also like almost like okay, like you work for 1 day, here you go, $150, $450, 500, 650. You send me your invoice, right? Then it's up to the owners, the producers, to pay them. Now, if the producers run away, they finish the job, they shoot, the producers run away, or they don't pay them, there's no protection. These people who earn about 400 or 150, right, as low as 150 a day to say 600 to even the DOP who can earn up to 1,000 to 5,000 per day for shoot, have no protection. And the only recourse is for them to sue the producer, but you know, and they're not going to sue the producer.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so they're not. I mean, there is no protection for them. So that's where we are trying to, on the government side, to look and see what are the things that we can do to protect both parties, the employer and as well as the people on the ground who are working. Because there's nothing to there has been cases, the producers who ran out of money halfway on the shoot and then they don't pay, and then these people don't get paid. 6 months later, they still haven't got paid for a project that they've done, that they shot. You know, and what's it? The job's been done. I've already done my 10-day shoot and I've not been paid for the last 3-4 months. Where's the protection? Where can I go? You know, who protects me as a makeup artist who just, you know, that kind of thing. There's no association of makeup artists. Yeah, so these are the issues that the current industry, the arts, are facing. And it is a big problem, even right down to actors. For actors, of course, like you famous, you can put it on your social media and say, oh, yo, this producer didn't pay me for this production, you know. And because we're all in the slightly glamour industry, nobody wants to get that kind. But there are still cases. And the most affected are literally the workers behind the scenes. They are not protected at all, right down to the writers. I know writers who has been doing big movies, and to this day, for after 2-3 months, have not been paid. So that contract that they sign is meaningless. They don't get paid. Nobody follows that contract, you know. So yeah, and then when you talk to the producers, that's the other case. Like, these people, the writer sent me a script, but it's half done. It's not even good. So I just took another writer. You know, so where's the protection on both sides?
Yeah, I think here what we see is this disconnect, or perhaps like a vacuum, where there is no formal structure for or a formal outlet for the grievances of these gig workers. Prof. Norma, you mentioned earlier that you were not, you know, you want to maintain the low barrier of entry for the gig economy, for a lot of the industries in this economy. But then, as you mentioned before, there are issues with social protection, and in this case that Lina has raised, the lack of formal outlets for workers. What do you then see is a realistic option for people like Lina has spoken to, that are facing the same issues that we see also in Astro AWANI? We tend to give or shed light on a lot of people in the arts industry that face these kind of issues. So, you know, how do you see a more realistic structure for these grievances to be aired out?
As the well, not just the gig workers, but also even the formal sector unions are not a big thing in this country. but because it's not a formal, so-called formal contract, therefore you don't fall within a certain category. Yeah. Although there's some formality as in exchanges of contracts, to say that you have to perform such work, and you will be paid 20% upfront, and then later subsequently you'll be paid upon what do you call that, good performance. Yeah. So, but there is no, as Lina mentioned, no unions, no one to fight whether this is a fair arrangement or not. Hence, you take it upon yourself. I think the government will have to come in, the policy, in number one, policy on social protection. I think we've been talking about in some other forums as well, there are several arrangements made by SOCSO, PECESO, and the EPF. I think these are some of the things that we have to make compulsory, not related to employment, but as a Malaysian citizen, or can be anyone living in Malaysia. Yeah. So I was hoping that maybe towards the end we'll be talking about this, but since you asked me, Naila, I will mention it. I think the protection has to, it need not come from the government to protect, but the government provide the regulatory or the framework for people to be protected. And of course, if they are low income, the government will have to come in. Yeah. So just in the past, was the end of last year, that the PM has announced for budget 2021, that about 20 million or so that is paid for social insurance for e-hailing drivers, yeah, for employment injury. Yeah. So the government has to step in order to provide some kind of protection. Yeah. And that also would mean that it would include savings for the future, savings for when you're old. And I agree with Sean. Yeah, when people know that they can draw down their savings, they will. I mean, I will take care of old me later when the time comes, but not now. I mean, nobody can imagine that they will be 60 years old, 65 years old when they're 25 or they're 30. They thought they're going to be 30 forever. Yeah. So it's the government that has to make it. I mean, we are proposing for it to be mandatory that every Malaysian, I propose an age, but apparently if you propose an age, you will face a challenge that some people work when even they were younger than 18 or 15. Yeah. But if you go by how we classify, as adults will be, or working adults will be 15, and for Malaysia, 15 to 59, because our retirement age is 60. So to make it compulsory for every adult, every Malaysian adult, to contribute to a fund, and this fund will be invested. So it is some kind of pooling of social insurance that everyone contribute, and it's the pool where you cross-subsidize. The richer will, so that is a system that PECESO has, for instance, the social insurance. So Naila, the only way that we can secure the future or to protect the or any kind of risks that our people go through, yeah, because it's not just old age. It is also, what if you're injured? I know that if they're lucky, they go on Grab platform, they're fine, they're insured. But Sean, how about those who are not on that kind of platform, if anything goes wrong with them? Hence, the proposal of the policy for the government to contribute to that 20 million for workers who will have to go through this kind of platform or work. Well, it is insured, because this is not insured at the moment. If the person is sick, what's going to happen to him and his family? Yeah. Or become disabled. So we are in discussions, and we are, I think you're aware that there is a Malaysian Social Protection Council, my SPC, that the Prime Minister chairs my SPC. So a lot of these discussions will go into that, and the kind of work that you all are doing and all that will become policy input, that how would we, going forward, because this is not going to become less. gig workers or the self-employed and informal economy will not be less. And as you all mentioned, technology has further becomes the catalyst for people to opt for doing choosing how long they want to work, what type of work they want to do. Yeah. And I said this is a generational thing. I mean, my generation, the baby boomers, will slowly move out, yeah, and the new generation will come on, and they would prefer this kind of arrangements. But what does that mean to our nation? Yeah? So policies will have to think about these new arrangements or the new mindset that our Malaysians have. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Prof. Did you want to say something now?
Yeah, I wanted, sorry, Nell, you go. I wanted to actually mention about the EPF and SOCSO in the industry, because, I mean, I've seen many of my friends who are actors. Actors, I mean, unfortunately, are the high-profile ones. And in FINAS, we actually have a system where we actually try and give some back. But, you know, they get sick and they cannot act, and that's it. That's the end of your career. But it's the entry level into getting into a EPF and SOCSO. I feel it's very important for the industry to do that, for all the freelancers. But the education is so little. I've had directors who I personally have said, okay, open an EPF account. And they go like, but how do we do? I said, okay, never mind. We went and researched for them, and we realized there is no category as an individual to apply and put in an EPF. So we said, oh wait, there's a housewife category. Very funny, housewife category. Look, you can write yourself as a housewife, and then you put in and say that this is the money that you can put in under housewife. I mean, if she doesn't have a proper employer, even, you know, there is no way that she can like put into EPF. So we were trying to help these people, some of our workers, the regulars that we work with, our directors, actors and all that. And there isn't, like, where's the SOCSO for them? We take insurance for all the industry. When we do a movie, we'll take a overall personal accident. Anything happens on the set, they are covered. But what goes after that, you know, they get an accident driving outside, there is no protection. They can't join SOCSO, they can't join POKESO. Is there? And there's no education for it, I guess, or maybe it's there and nobody's looking at it.
Yeah. And now you wanted to say something. If you could keep it slightly briefly, because we do have a lot of good questions coming in, and I do want to move on to the Q&A session.
Oh, okay, noted, Naila. Thank you. Really, really glad that you brought that up, Lina. I think having, and by the way, right now there is already a category for freelancers to enroll into EPF, so they don't have to do the housewife category anymore. But yeah, I think the main thing is, right, okay, can we make enrollment easier for everybody and not have to rely on public education all the time? And one of those things, and I know that Prof. Norma agrees with me on this, and, you know, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants on this, right? It would be just better to automatically enroll everybody. And this is a policy decision that also needs to, you know, have policymakers bite the bullet on it. Oh, thanks, Naila.
Sorry, Naila, super quick one. I just want to call out something that may not be very obvious, but we talk about EPF as though it's a protection that sort of comes down from the sky. But in reality, that basically is a forced contribution. It's forcing people to set aside money. So it's not like, hey, let's create this safety net. It's more like let's mandate people to put aside money for the future. I think that's a critical component. And for that to happen, people need to earn enough to not mind putting aside money. Yeah. So I think that income needs to be protected as well.
Yep.
A lot of interesting points here, but I do want to move on to the question and answer session, because I do want our audience to feel like they're a part of this conversation, of course. So we've got a lot of really interesting one, but I do want to go to Hakim's question. Additional to the rise of gig jobs, I'm also getting a lot of people in the formal industry that is working under contract. 12 months contract and will be renewed if required, for example. So I would like to get the panelists' opinions. Are we seeing a lot of work going the freelance format even in the formal traditional work? If this is the case, should we consider a universal policy for types of workers? So I think I am reminded of what Sean said earlier of how the traditional model of the workforce can learn a lot from the informal workforce and the gig economy and whatnot, especially its aspects of flexibility, of working hours, and the amount of control and freedom that a worker has in some aspects. So in this sense, maybe I'd like to ask for Sean's opinion on this. What do you think can be learned from Grab's model of a gig platform, which is, I would see it as sort of a unique form of its own. It's very much different to how the arts industry functions. You have a very specific set of ideas about how a worker has control and freedom of the jobs that they take on. And so this is, what do you think? And I do want to move on a bit from the questions of protection and social policies and whatnot, but just seeing as what do you think are the main components that can be drawn out from the gig economy to the more traditional workforce, or should there be much amalgamation between the two? Should there be a universal policy? What do you think?
Yeah, so at the beginning we talked about how the gig economy is often associated with flexibility, and it's been around for a very long time, this economy. What the digital economy brings to the gig conversation is that it actually allows this demand to just be switched on, almost on tap. People talk about the on-demand economy as though you get food or rights on demand, but actually it's income on demand as well. So one of the biggest, draws to the digital economy working together with the gig economy is that we can basically split up, jobs into bite-sized chunks, and then people can work whenever they want. When we talk about more traditional types of work, for example, 12-month contracts, you no longer have this issue where you want to just be able to turn on and get a 12-month job tomorrow. You do have time. You do have 2-3 weeks to maybe go around and speak to people. So ultimately, I do think that this specific model of digital economy is very much suited to like that pure flexibility, all the way down to I want to work for 1 hour, not so much the 12-month program.
Nell, what do you think about this? The same question that Hakim raised here about a universal policy. How then? I think Prof. Norma mentioned this before about social protection schemes and how this should be made compulsory, not exactly or directly related to the types of employment or age, even, because I think the biggest lesson that we can take from the pandemic is that it's not just about age, it's not just about health risks, it's about the entire economy on the brink of shutting down. That risk is now always there. And so how do you see then labor policy as a whole? Should that then also be re-examined?
Absolutely.
When we're talking about the gig economy?
No, absolutely. This increasing informalization, so what we used to have, basically a majority of contracts are open-ended, and now because businesses are getting a lot more cautious, they don't know the shape of the recovery, right? Even with the vaccination rollout, you can't tell the future, right? But they've gotten burned. So many of these contracts would now probably be turned into more temporary contracts, whereas before it was open-ended. So what does that mean, right? Do we call everybody gig workers then who are on these contracts? Arguably, no, but you still do need to have long-term thinking about what happens to these sort of workers. So let's say you are on a 12-month contract, right? So like Sean said, it's not like you can just turn on your phone and then get the 12-month contract tomorrow, right? So there are some barriers to entry. It is not a one-off or a quick task. So how do we make sure that you still have the benefits that a formal full-time employee had, right? So then, we get into questions about how do we enroll people, what kind of protection schemes there are to get people automatically in them, right? Automatically enroll. How do we get deductions done, and all that sort of stuff. But the quick answer to your question, sorry, is that you do need a policy for this kind of worker, and presumably there is one called the independent. It's around independent contractors, but it needs to be more developed than what it is currently.
All right, thank you. And now I'm just going to speed through some of the other questions. I did mention this before. This is from Tay Tawan from a policy perspective.
Naila, can I just add to the question, Hakim's
Yes,
question?
please, go ahead.
If I can also mention that for informal sector, there is also a thing called Aisaraan in the EPF, that they can contribute to, and also for SOCSO is the self-employment injury scheme, that is also voluntary. But all these are voluntary, Sean. You rightly mentioned that it's not mandatory, whereas what we were talking about earlier was mandatory. If I can add to Hakim's the discussion on Hakim's question, he was talking about informality in the formal setting. So I'm not sure whether he was referring to the government sector or the public sector or the private sector. Now, typically, if you are in the government sector, when a job has to be done and there is not enough people to do the work, they will hire contract workers. And this is the short-term contracts. So they are not covered. It's not a long-term arrangement, but short-term. However, the contribution for SOCSO and EPF is compulsory now. So, but there are some cases where the 12 month is actually a trial period, that you see whether the person is suitable or not, and if the person is, then you offer a longer contract. So sometimes it's not due to whether the employer would like to make it informal, but it is very context based, depending on the situation of the job or the type of jobs that is being offered. Thanks, Naila.
Thank you so much. And just a note for everyone, we are extending the discussion for another 10 minutes just because a lot of the questions are now just coming in. And I think I do want to go over some of these questions raised, if that's okay with everyone. So as I was saying, I do want to move on to this question from K Tawan. I hope that's right. From a policy perspective, what is the view of the panel on the recent news that Uber has been instructed to reclassify their drivers in the UK as actual workers? I did pose this question before, but to Nell, I believe. And the journalist in me is yearning to hear what Sean has to say on this issue. So what do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I think, first of all, like a point of context, right? I used to live and work in London, and in the UK, a lot of the people in the gig economy are migrants. They earn below minimum wage. And I guess like there needs to be some form of protection in terms of like workers need to get a certain minimum wage, because otherwise you're just bypassing the laws, right? In Malaysia, I can't speak for every platform, but a lot of the big platforms actually pay well above minimum wage, like well above minimum wage. A lot of our drivers are actually M40, just on their income alone. If their wife or some other members of family works, then maybe higher. And I think then it's a very different conversation, right? It's not about should we protect you on the minimum income. It's more how do we get you, again, I mean, going back to the protection point, but how do we get you to, for example, buy health insurance? I think those are the bigger, we're fortunate to be able to talk about things like that. Also, our gig economy participants are all Malaysians, so it's also a very different conversation. But yeah, that's sort of the main point. Just the second thing on the policy itself. So with that context in mind, the other thing in the Uber case in UK, similar to in California, is that ultimately they realize, and I think Nell pointed this out as well, they realize that it's not so straightforward. You can't just call them workers because they are flexible, and workers are not flexible. No one wants to say like, Grab told me to work 5 to 7 p.m. If I don't work those hours today, I'm fired, right? Like no one wants that. It's a bit different. Ultimately, they use the word workers quite liberally, but it comes down to minimum wage and social protection.
Then that raises the question of our minimum wage, right? But that's a whole other issue, and I can go on for that. But that's for another day. That's already introduces a whole set of other issues because our minimum wage is very questionable. So I do want to move on to the next question. This goes directly specific to what kind of realistic policy ideas we can think of. So when we're talking about social protection schemes for gig workers, I think this is a question from Hakim again. Perlukah pekerja gig atau freelancers, gig workers diberikan tahap perlindungan sosial berbeza berdasarkan jumlah waktu jam bekerja? Contohnya bekerja 20 jam seminggu, layak mendapat perlindungan insurans dan perubatan. So do gig workers, should gig workers be given social protection schemes based on the amount of hours they work? I did raise this question before. Should we then look at different schemes based on the type of industry that they're working in, the nature of their jobs? This one goes directly to the amount of hours. Is this realistic? I think Nell could probably help with this one.
Okay. I think, taking the word realistic very broadly, right? I think it is possible. But there are certain issues that needs to be worked out that goes into how things really happen on the ground. So for instance, this 20 hours, right? How often is that performed? How sustainable, is it over like many months? And what is the proportion of contribution? Because currently, right, under full-time employment, there is already an expectation that you are going to work X amount of hours over a number of days, over a number of years. And so there is your set of contribution to, the various social protection schemes, as well as the employer contribution. Now, when it is not clear, basically your hours can be off and on depending on your lifestyle, how do you do that, right? So I think it is possible to work something out, but it is not straightforward. And you actually do have to spend some time really thinking about how you would structure the formula and, work it out. But yeah, short answer is I do think it is possible, but it's a little bit complicated.
Okay, thank you. And this is from T Tawan as well. Would a 0 hours contract provide the protection needed by both employers and gig employees? Lina, are you familiar with the 0 hours contracts? Do you think you can paint a picture of how this would actually work? Has this worked in the arts industry, and what are some challenges faced when implementing this kind of contract or understanding between the employee and employer?
I'm not familiar with the terminology 0 hours contracts, so I cannot really answer that because and actually I feel that because there's a question, right, interesting in the chat group that I saw, what's the difference between freelancers and gig workers? I think it's very, very different. What Sean from Grab, some of my people in my industry also do Grab. They're Grab food drivers, they're Grab drivers, because it supplements their income in between the days when they're not shooting. Freelancers to me is when you freelance because you have a skill. You're almost like providing a skill to an industry, which is like ours. We hire you as a freelancer because you have a skill, but you're not free to like come and go as you have. We have times, we have shoot times. You're an actor, you need to arrive at 5 in the morning. We finish shoot at midnight. You have to be there until we finish shoot. It's written in our contract. Same thing for the you're not as free as like, okay, I'll come and go as I please, it's not. So there's a big difference. And for us, our contracts with our freelancers, especially ones like actors, directors, cameramen, they are very airtight. We don't leave that much for, okay, this is the amount of time we need you to shoot, because it's the more tighter the contract is, the more clearer it is, and the more easier it is in terms of both parties. For the other workers, which is we call like the crew workers, there is a contract that we negotiate whether you have overtime or no overtime, because they have no control over the time that we shoot, for instance, that is the control by the directors, controlled by the producer. So they are there, and we say, okay, 12 hours. After 12 hours, it's a unwritten rule, you get paid 1.5 times more per hour based on the per hour. So it's up to the producer to negotiate individually with the crew, to say, look, I will do, I'll pay you overtime after 12 hours, but that 12 hours mustn't include like food, lunch and dinner. So that means give me another hour for that, and then it's over 13 hours. So I'm not sure the 0 contract, to answer that question, I'm not too sure. Yeah.
Okay, not to worry, but interesting anyway that you were able to answer another question, the difference between gig worker and a freelancer. This moves a bit further away from what we were talking about, but I think quite interesting anyway. Prof. Norma, you did mention earlier about how the origin of the gig economy came about, especially in the Malaysian context. This was an earlier question. What are the stigmas or biases that are still appended to the idea of a gig worker today? The first thing I can think of is the instability, but I think when we're looking back at the origins of the word itself, it could perhaps be related to the more informal economy, which, has certain stigmas or biases attached to it or used to, but I think that has evolved over time. What do you think, Prof?
Thank you. Also, if I can add, okay, that's interesting. But if I can add to Lina's point, Lina was right when the zero-hour contract, that was talking about, which essentially means that the employer doesn't have to guarantee any hours. Yeah, but it's a contract that's entered. So Lina was saying that, how do you justify, or how do you provide for when someone can either come in or not? But what it means is that the employer doesn't have to guarantee the minimum hours that he or she has to perform the work. Yeah. But what I like about the question, if I can also touch upon some of the issues raised earlier about the universal policy. I like it, Hakim, the word universality. Yeah. So universality would cover some of the things Naila mentioned about the stigma or biases that you have with part-time job, temporary jobs, gig jobs, etc. Yeah, because, and to lump them together is not fair on one hand, but on the other hand, to have a policy that's so loose and not protecting the workers just because you assume that some are earning very well, very, very high. Yeah, the skilled freelancers. If you want to differentiate between, the gig workers and the freelance, the skilled freelance, which we used to say in the past, you can do that. However, not you will have to care for everyone. So social protection that we want for the country will be a social protection that someone feels secured or feel that they are protected if they are faced if they are faced with a crisis. Yeah, so it could be losing a job, it could be being sick, etc. So if you have that kind of security, what is useful for the economy also is that you can take risks, and this ties in with Malaysia wanting a more innovative society, wants people to take risk. So if they feel that if anything goes wrong with them, your family will go hungry, or they will, your debt and all that, they're going to have lots of problems, they will not take that risk. And a society that is risk averse will not be innovative. And without innovation, you cannot contribute to higher productivity. So there is a very strong connection between providing good protection and having a functional and productive society. So I think the end goal is that what we want is a productive society or productive members of the society. So it doesn't matter whether in what type of job. So when we talk about social protection, we want to move away from just employment-based, although it has to happen, the active labor market, the training, the upskilling, reskilling has to happen as well. But in terms of protection, it cannot be just tied in to just employment. It's got to be tied into who and one faces this situation. Now, if you're talking about, I think it is easier for schemes, for us to come up with schemes to cover work injury or employment injury, like the one that PESO has introduced, and the government has contributed about 20 or 24 million to that fund on behalf of the low-income workers. But to talk about unemployment benefits, as PESO has now, where you call it job allowance, job search allowance, where you are paid, your salary is paid, decreasing a trend though for 6 months if you are fired. Yeah, it is harder to come up with that kind of scheme. But for that scheme, South Korea has implemented the scheme. So it can be a minimum of 20 hours, 30 hours per week. Yeah, like what Nell has said earlier. It can be, we can define that, a minimum of 30 hours, 40 hours. So that's one aspect of social protection. So there are various aspects, Naila. Thank you.
So sorry to cut you off there, but we are already 10 minutes over the initial time that we planned for this discussion. But as I have expected, this could go on. There's just so much to unpack. And I think we have also managed to touch on other issues, minimum wage, the entire labor policy of our country as a whole. But I think to sum things up, what Prof. Norma said was really interesting. The idea of a universal protection scheme that's not necessarily tied to employment, because when we're talking about the rights and the protection of gig workers, that then touches on the rights of other workers as well. That has made me reflect on my own rights and protection as a worker, as formalized as I am in this company. So, it raises a lot of questions about the labor ecosystem as a whole, but nonetheless, a good discussion and a necessary discussion anyway. So thank you so much to everyone. Sean and Lina were able to paint us different pictures of how the gig economy looks like today and how this has evolved over time, and what can be the next step forward. Prof. Norma and Nell has also managed to, I think, simplify these terms. What I think were much more mystified before this, gig economy encompasses so many things, but I think we were able to break that down into simpler terms, realistic examples. And so thank you so much to all of the panelists today, and as well as the audience, for sharing so many interesting questions that were able to stretch our discussion from left and right. And don't forget to rate us 5 stars as you leave this discussion. And do send us some feedback as well. What do you think, and what would you like to see in the future? Once again, I'd like to say thanks to all of our panelists, Dr. Emeritus Professor Dr. Norma Mansor, Director of Social Wellbeing Research Center, Lalita Omar, Research Director of Centrist Think Tank, The Center, Sean Goh, Managing Director of Grab Malaysia, Lina Tan, Managing Director of Red Communications. Thank you once again to everyone. We hope you enjoyed the discussion today, and we hope you were able to take home some of the key points. And a particular shout out to Sean. Thanks for answering some of the other questions that people had specifically for Grab in the chat room. We weren't able to touch on that, but thank you so much. And we hope to see you again in the future with more discussions. Thanks once again, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Naila.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.